Why not switch over to advocating for a single, secular state, one man, one vote for all Israelis and Palestinians?
Very simply, it's not available. I just don't think it's an achievable goal, unless you were to project many decades into the future, again, and have a counterfactual reality.
I think that it's really mind-boggling to call this not an achievable goal, even though it hasn't been tried, next to the two-state solution, which has been tried for decades, which has proven less achievable.
This huge body of international law, international consensus, majority opinion on both sides, wanting this thing, okay, and to look at that and say, because over 20 years we haven't been able to achieve it, and we're all equally frustrated with that, I think, that therefore the corrective is to tackle a task that is infinitely, exponentially more difficult to achieve, which is not to end the occupation, but to fundamentally change or transform or replace the Israeli state with a different kind of state. And there we leave the realm utterly of international consensus, international law, what is politically feasible, even conceptually, and we enter into a realm of counterfactual fantasy, in my view.
All of this political support, international law on our side, a consensus that we have internationally, and failure, not just failure to end the occupation, but an entrenchment in the occupation. The idea, the other basic and flawed assumption, is that occupation conjures this concept of partition. There is no partition. There is no two states to speak of. The Israeli and Palestinian populations live in inextricable population centers. What divides them is the settler colonial condition that privileges a Jewish population vis-a-vis a non-Jewish Palestinian
exactly.
population.
Thank you so much for putting it
You're
that
very
way.
welcome.
Because that is exactly correct. In other words, we have the one-state solution. Do you like it? Because if you don't like it, the really revolutionary thing, the really revolutionary thing is two states. I mean, that's the big change. All right, there's no way to take this structure of separate and unequal, radical, discriminatory structure and occupation and non-citizenship and disenfranchisement within the greater Israeli state and turn it into an equitable democratic state for all of its people.
That's a really dismal outcome. You have no faith in humanity and in history. Historical examples that have done precisely that.
Where?
So in South Africa, there wasn't an equality. In the U.S., in a U.S. population of slavery that transformed into Jim Crow, that's transformed into a civil rights movement, that's still transforming.
You can't possibly think that the South African model in its details applies in Palestine, because you're talking there about an overwhelming majority that was disenfranchised, allowing a privileged minority to keep all of its money and wealth and property and everything that it had accumulated until the day apartheid ended. Even the jobs, even the civil service jobs, they got to keep until they were retired. Not one Krugerrand was taken away from white South Africans. What they had to give up was political power. It was the best deal. It was a total win-win deal for both sides. No one has ever told me what a win-win deal for Israelis and Palestinians would look like. And first of all, you have to ask the question, who gets the stuff? And that was the question that was answered in South Africa. You guys can keep your stuff. No one-state solution advocate has explained to me what happens to the stuff. And in Israel, Palestine, that's the land, which before 48 almost entirely belonged to Palestinians and has been appropriated through the absentee property law and all kinds of other tricks and maneuvers and laws and what have you, and taken by the Israeli state, and now theoretically is owned by the JNF and administered by the Israel Land Authority. What happens to that land? And what's in it for the Israel? I need to understand, ultimately, what's in it for this power. We've agreed that there's this huge asymmetry of power. So you've got to make a case to the Jewish Israelis that what the big win is going to be for them. You ask, why would they give up any of the occupied territories? Right? Fine. Much harder to ask them to give up their own state and this thing that they fought to build. They would be giving it up. So, in their point of view, they would be giving it up because they want a Jewish state. Now, it's true that the occupation makes it a farce, But as you've agreed, right now they live in peace and comfort in this Tel Aviv, Haifa bubble on the coast, and they don't see Palestinians, in the occupied territories except at checkpoints. And that's basically If that. And most of them don't even go there.
Let's tackle that specific issue.
Yeah.
The idea that for a one-state solution to happen, Palestinian refugees returning, what there is now is Israeli cities and malls and towns and all that.
Right.
What happens to that land when Palestinians return?
I think that these are all excellent questions, and I invite you and everyone else who's interested to be a part of discussions to figure that out exactly. Failure to have the perfect answer doesn't mean that this goal.
But
can I finish? I have not. I did once and I stopped.
No,
and so,
go ahead. I agree.
Any outcome, any political thinking actually needs some strategizing, and we haven't invested the same amount of money, political will, energy, organizing that has gone into the two-state solution. So why not actually try to do this? And so it's not to say no solution, by the way, whether it's two-state or one-state, would immediately be the panacea to some milk and honey version of society. Each one will be imperfect. Each one will be difficult. Each one would be, I think, violent. The question is, what will lead to the more optimal outcome? And under all accounts, the more optimal outcome is a one-state solution because the two-state solution, aside from being dead, doesn't address the fundamental issue, which is Israel's settler colonial structure, which was also regulated under international law. So if we do switch to one state, we have plenty of law to help us navigate this. So Israel's settler colonial structure is what's at issue. Consider that within Israel, its electric utility company employs 30,000 citizens. Of its population, the 20% Palestinian population, only 6 of those 30,000 are not Jewish. Its water utility company employs 10,000 citizens, and only 4 are Palestinian and not Jewish. So we have a structure that frankly needs to be tackled from the inside out. And a two-state solution moves us farther and farther away from it. In fact, what it does is it actually allows Israel to fulfill its vision of the 1967 Alon Plan, which, if we graph that directly onto the map of the West Bank today, is eerily symmetrical. And so what I'm advocating is that we begin to think in more courageous and visionary ways, and we invest that energy that we're willing to invest because we all agree that something needs to change. And if we invest that energy in something that leads to a more optimal outcome, we should.
Okay, I've been following the one-state discourse since it emerged more than 10 years ago. And there have been a bunch of
much older.
Well, no, I know, but let's say in its current form. Of course it's much older. And in fact, it was originally a Jewish idea.
Yeah,
when Jews were a minority, it appealed to them. So that when they felt the weaker side, it had a constituency, and none at all among Palestinians, I might add. Then it switched, and it switched. Okay, so this is an idea that appeals to the powerless much more than the powerful. But the point is not that, because I've paid attention since the rebirth of it after the Second Intifada, which really I think is when it really sort of takes off again, and I've been waiting patiently for someone to start answering any of those basic questions. I think 10 years is a long time for a bunch of academics and intellectuals who have put a lot of effort into explaining why they believe this is just, to begin explaining how they think it could happen. And so I actually could imagine that theoretically there might be a version of a one-state vision that could answer those questions to Israelis and could appeal to them in a certain way. It's not out of the realm of the imagination, but it has to be done. And the reason that it hasn't been done, I think, is that nobody knows how to do it. I don't think that these questions haven't been asked. They've been posed by people like me for years and years, and others. No, okay, what this, what that, what this, what that. And answer comes there none. Because I don't think there are any answers at this point to those things. I mean, I think I could have done a better job had I been a one-stater.
Well, then you should join the troop and lead the charge.
Here's the point: I just don't see the purpose in pursuing something that ultimately can't be achieved in my lifetime.
The idea that there hasn't been anything, there's actually been several conferences convened by academics, the Trans-Arab Research Institute, Boston University, there's been Harvard University last year, and there's been several compilations of these types, I'm just talking about the United States. several compilations of these ideas. This past year, I participated at BU for a conference on the right of return, where the entire conference was based on presenting practical solutions. None of the banner waving, but practical solutions that actually demonstrated initiatives. So to say that you haven't seen anything in the past 10 years is this either disingenuous or I'll be happy to share it with you. I'll be happy to share it with you, and then you can decide based on the content.
Yeah,
I actually think it's somewhat substantive.
Here we have to disagree.
Fine, and that's fine. But I just think we should correct the record.
I think it's
let's hold to the specific point.
Okay.
We should correct the record that there has been
there's a disagreement.
A number of strides. Now, whether or not there have been political efforts to lead a charge, that's not even controversial. You're absolutely right. There has been no political charge to actually make this a campaign and to think about it more strategically. That I completely agree with you. You're right. And part of that reason is there's a lot of reasons. There's many reasons that we as analysts can discuss of what's prohibited or inhibited this kind of coalescence and discussion. And we'll just leave that aside because I want to address what you want to say.
It couldn't be said, though, it couldn't be argued that that's because the only framework is the two-state solution framework. Because there is a lively
I didn't make that argument.
No,
I actually said we'd have that discussion later.
I know you didn't. I'm saying it can't. I'm not saying you argue. I'm saying it couldn't be argued that that the reason for that is because there's only a two-state solution framework. Apart from dealing with the Israelis, who have this greater Israel, the Israelis who do hold to an annexationist vision, you've also got the main debate among Palestinians, especially in the occupied territories, between two-state solution proponents attached to the leadership in Ramallah and Hamas, which has a kind of one Islamic state vision, a kind of
actually, Hamas has a lot of visions. One of them happens to be two states, as indicated by their conversations with European officials. The other happens to be even worse, which is something of an Islamic vision that has nothing to do with Palestinian nationalism or the state itself.
Well, actually, I actually agree with the second point, but my point is, there's space. Well, it is important. Let me explain why I raise it. I raise it because it means that within Palestinian society, there's space for visions other than the two-state solution, and at least one that has seriously challenged it is the Islamic pan-Islamic state in this Islamic Waqf, which is what Hamas wants.
And now you can join the movement to challenge it with other movements like this resuscitation of a Palestinian National Council. The absence of leadership and the vacuum of Palestinian leadership that has been afforded the space to speak on behalf of all Palestinians without any authority. I'm not saying any leadership. There is no authority. For Fatah specifically, that presidential mandate expired in 2009 and it was extended for a year, and since 2010 the leadership has been ruling without a mandate. Ditto Hamas, for obvious reasons. And so then we ask ourselves, well then how do we hold the leadership to account so that it can speak on behalf of what Palestinians want? Well, it can, because both authorities, and especially the Fatah-based authorities we know, are externally funded by exogenous forces, and so they're more accountable. Both parties. Look, I'm not defending Hamas. If you're listening to me, I'm not defending. I said both, especially so, and so the idea that they're funded by external forces that makes them more accountable to third-party states than they are to their own Palestinian base puts into question whether or not we can say what do Palestinians want and what have they done, because they haven't been able to speak for themselves at all. And they don't have an accountable leadership, which makes their situation much more similar to Yemen's Saleh and Tunisia's Ben Ali regime, and so on and so forth.
There's a point of convergence here, although it has to be said one of the main external funding in Gaza, not to Hamas but to the people of Hamas, is the public salaries that are paid for by Ramallah, which in turn get their support from the West, from the Gulf states, etc. The Palestinians don't have an economy that can survive without aid at this point. So aid from somewhere is necessary.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is a very terrible thing for the Palestinian people, and I think that's clear. The point of convergence we've reached here is about the need to open up the Palestinian political space. There's been, especially in the West Bank historically, under the British, under the Jordanians, and even under the Israelis, a thriving civil society that is in the process of constricting. And in Gaza, it's been pretty much crushed by Hamas, and it's constricting in the West Bank, and it's all but smashed in Gaza. And this is a terrible thing. So one of the crucial things for Palestinians in the next few years is to open their political space, and particularly in the occupied territories where they're concentrated, but even more broadly, and beyond.
And beyond, because Palestinians live, 63% of them live in diaspora.
Sure, and that's an important factor. But you certainly have a potential, and it's been proven, a voting bloc of people who could exercise their will at the polls. And I completely agree that this stale binary between a dysfunctional Fatah in the West Bank and a kind of fanatical and terrorist designated Hamas, which is a terrible thing for the people of Gaza, is not a workable framework. So there's got to be something beyond that.
We agree.
I think we found a point of convergence.
But I wanted to get back specifically to the question of whether the two-state solution is dead. How do you see the two-state solution still being potentially achieved?
There are several reasons to think that a two-state solution is possible in the long run. And I actually quite like Aaron David Miller's formulation, where he said that the two-state solution is too big to succeed now, but too big to fail indefinitely. And I think that's about right. Because I don't think there's an alternative to ending the conflict. It's true that there are many demographic and administrative and topographical and infrastructural changes imposed in the occupied territories by Israel that have undermined the likelihood of a Palestinian state and made the border harder to draw and made it more difficult and all of that stuff. It's still, there are two things though. It's still possible to draw a map in which you would have a land swap of less than 4%. All these things that I've described are acts of political will, and they can be put there and they can be taken out. There is no question, can settlements be evacuated? We know they can because they were in Gaza and the northern West Bank. It is possible. Is it something that's going to happen under the current government, under the current situation? No, it's not. The question is, what are they going to do with these 4.5 million Palestinians? Are they going to make them citizens of Israel? No, they're not. Are they going to be able to keep them as disenfranchised non-citizens in different legal statuses in all these different cantons permanently? That's a recipe for continued conflict, and I don't think it's stable, and I don't think it's tenable. That it is definitely still possible to achieve a two-state solution. The biggest single reason, if you ask me, is that Israel needs it. They don't have any real alternative except to lose their Israeli state. Because what they have now is really a kind of a mockery of the idea of a Jewish and democratic state, because it does not have a Jewish majority and it is not a democratic reality. The de facto Israeli state is neither. There's a de jure Israeli state, but as long as they keep blending the two together, what you've got is something that even Israeli leaders have called an apartheid state. And if this is a permanent situation, right, and then they've got an existential crisis of the highest order.
If they create that existential crisis for themselves by increasing that mixing, does then the outcome become an inevitable one state that's going to democratize over a very long time?
It's possible that over many, many decades, we have no idea. I'm frankly, I'm not interested in any idea that looks to 50 years plus from now. This is an emergency. The occupation is an emergency. 4.5 million people living under these conditions is an exigency that needs dealing with now. And if a one state is inevitable for those reasons, two states is simply a way station towards one state, frankly. If it's an inevitability because people are so intertwined and interdependent, it'll happen anyway. I actually think it's much easier to imagine a confederated single state emerging out of Palestinian independence first than it is to leap from this occupation into some kind of equitable confederation between two sovereign entities.
Perfect equation. The two-state solution has been dead. The two-state solution would assume, based on 242 and 338, that the West Bank, based on the 1967 borders, and the Gaza Strip would constitute a Palestinian state, somehow connected with... You can't possibly interrupt me now.
Sorry.
That would be connected somehow by a magic bridge or a tunnel or something of the sort. And so what we see right now on the ground is the absolute destruction of a two-state solution. Anybody who pays attention to topography and actual maps or does something like radical, like visit the region, will see that of the West Bank, 40% of the West Bank, which is the Jordan Valley, has now been declared all but a military zone, which is off access to the Palestinian population. Of their 400,000 population in 1967, only 56,000 remain today. That's 40% of the West Bank, which is on the easternmost border of the West Bank, adjacent to Jordan. Then we'll think about the annexation wall, which now runs 85% of its route runs into the West Bank, which is supposed to be only part of the state, and it's annexed 13% of that land. Now we consider that the settler population is up to 600,000. We also want to consider that the Israeli municipality in Jerusalem has said that it wants to tip its demographic balance in Jerusalem from a 60-40 balance between Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Jerusalemites to a 70-30 by 2020. That's not to say anything. That's not to say anything about the increased separation between the West Bank and Gaza, not least of which because of the siege and the isolation, not least of which because of Military Order 1650, which has removed anybody who's from Gaza who happens to be in the West Bank back to Gaza in order to instill and entrench that separation. All of this is to say it's not stipulated
by me.
These are all they were not. I'm demonstrating that these are not exercises in fantasy. This is on the ground. I just want to be able to finish about why it's dead.
The floor is still yours. I just want you to address specifically the idea that all of what you're describing obviously make the existence of a Palestinian state very difficult to imagine, but what about the issue that, specifically the question is, because Israel ultimately needs a Palestinian state, that everything you're describing is reversible to some degree?
But this is so, I wish I was allowed to finish. I listened so patiently to Hussein's insightful comments. And so, to finish that comment, these conditions demonstrate not just the difficulties
facing establishment of a Palestinian state, but its death. Israel, when it removed its 8,000 settlers from Gaza, then placed immediately 12,500 into the West Bank. And now the numbers have exponentially risen. Israel has needed a Palestinian state since 1967, and yet has not done so because it needs to avoid its existential crisis to implement one, and yet doesn't. Because it doesn't have the pressure to do so, and it doesn't have the incentive to do so. It could do everything that it does and get away with it, and it can't afford to live without the water resources, and specifically the western aquifer that is in the West Bank, where it derives 80% of its water yield. And so we're talking about a situation. Israel has acted against its own interests since 1967. Now it's pursued that policy course not only since 1967, but for 20 years of a peace process where it's entrenched it, killed the two-state solution. And suddenly, the Israeli state is going to say, okay, now we realize we've gone too far. No, there is a polity within Israel that's been proven that it can go too far and get away with it, and ultimately the Palestinians can live either on segregated reservations, if it's a one-state solution, or in Bantustans if it's a two-state solution. So whatever strategy we pursue has to be a strategy that fundamentally challenges that premise. And unfortunately, the two-state solution doesn't do it because it envisions a solution with land swaps, which would basically entrench the Bantustanization of the Palestinian people.
It depends what kind of land swap you're looking at. I don't think that's necessarily true at all. I've seen perfectly reasonable land swaps based on current and done by very, very cynical people, by the way, people who are extreme skeptics and who know more about this than all three of us in this room together will ever know, and who are very, very skeptical people. And when they say, if Danny Seidemann, who is about the most cynical and skeptical guy I can think of, tells me that the Clinton parameters could still today be applied in occupied East Jerusalem, I've got to say I'm in no position to challenge him on that. This guy knows every rock. So it is what Noura was describing, which is all perfectly accurate and important, was all covered by my list of demographic and infrastructural and topographic and administrative changes forced, and that's what I was talking about, and you've illustrated it, and you're right. So if you were to think that something like the military zone of 40% is an irreversible land grab, of course you'd be right. But it's not an annexation. It's what an occupying power actually can do under the Geneva Convention, which is create giant. I mean, maybe they've gone
Where
too
would
far.
the Palestinians
but
live?
What
state would they live in?
In almost all
Where?
of the West Bank. I'm saying all of that has to change. All of that has to go. You can't have that military range. I'm talking, as I said, about a land swap of less than 4%, in which also the Palestinians get, something like 1-to-1, very close to 1-to-1, if not 1-to-1, and should be 1-to-1, land from Israel, and I think they live mostly where they are.
If it matters, land swaps are illegal under international law.
They're not illegal.
They're absolutely
How are they
illegal.
If they're mutually agreed?
Land that's occupied cannot be swapped. You cannot transfer civilian population into that territory. And so if it matters, we should consider that. That's one. Two, Palestinians are expected to continue living in whatever conditions they currently live in, and to get by with a little bit more comfort, and somehow to create contiguity with Gaza with no meaningful sovereignty. And there's no plan to act. There's no meaningful sovereignty when they can't control their own borders and own their own industries.
I think we pretty much exhausted this particular question. We all agree that Palestinians live in a way that is unacceptable today, and we disagree whether any of the changes that Israel has made in the occupied territories are reversible or not, so that viable Palestinian statehood can come about. So I don't think we're going to come to an agreement on this, so let's just move on to our final question, which is the question of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and how much it can achieve. I know Noura is a supporter of the movement. I know you're a lot more skeptical of what the movement can actually achieve. So let's start with you.
The movement is Janus face. There is not. I mean, there's the movement in theory and the movement in reality. And the movement in reality is a great thing. The movement, as it exists practically, is excellent. Because what's useful here is boycotts like the EU sanctions, which are great. And like most of the boycott efforts that have been successfully engaged in, mostly in Europe, all of them put the question of the occupation centermost, and they target the occupation. With the exception of cultural matters, individual performers, things like that, or individuals, like Stephen Hawking, beyond that, but institutionally, boycotts that target Israel as a whole have not proven effective, and I don't think there's going to be a big market for them in the United States, in Europe, or in East Asia and South Asia. I think that you're in very solid ground when you target the occupation and have boycotts, and that's why you look at the boycotts that exist, and they're all always about the occupation. The boycott movement, as a rhetorical thing, is dominated by people who want to target Israel tout court. And there's a problem here, because I think to have a successful campaign, you need to have three things that don't exist right now, unfortunately, and I wish they did. One is a convergence between means and goals. Right now, the means are all about a two-state solution. They're all about ending the occupation. They target the occupation. The rhetoric of the people who say they lead the movement is about one-state solution and replacing Israel with a different state, with democratic and all. These are not in harmony, and that's a problem. The second thing is, and most important, is that any movement like this, grassroots movement, and as I say, I'm strongly in favor of anti-occupation and anti-settlement boycotts of all kinds, across the board, and almost without limits, is that it has to be done in coordination with some kind of political leadership that can turn the momentum that produces into some kind of action. And I think you've seen some Palestinian political leaders in the past. Certainly Fayyad was very interested in boycotting Israeli settlement goods around the world, supporting that, banning them from Palestinian stores and enforcing that, in trying to get Palestinian workers alternatives and actually making it technically illegal for them to work in settlements, and trying to drum up things. So there's a real effort on, and also participating in nonviolent protests against the wall, which the man did. And there are many civil society leaders in Palestinian political figures who have done that as well. So I don't think it is in any way impossible to get leadership, a Palestinian political leadership, interested in a serious targeted boycott movement that would divide Israelis, that will send the message to Israelis: it's not true that the future of Kiryat Arba is the same as the future of Tel Aviv. That's ridiculous. That's a settlement line. the message of a boycott movement that's going to be effective needs to be: Israel is a member state of the United Nations. All right, fine. That's one thing. But you're conducting an illegitimate, unlawful occupation that has to end. That's not okay, and especially the settlement activity is completely illegal, and we're not going to have anything to do with it. We're not going to contribute a penny to it in any way whatsoever. So I'm very much in favor of those kind of boycotts, but I think they need to be linked to a political leadership that can actually use the momentum of boycotts and nonviolent protests and things like that.
Noura, your response?
Actually, I don't want a response. I wanted to comment, not to respond to Hussein, but to comment on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I think that it's demonstrated on its own, its ability to change discourse. Prior to the 2005 call from the Boycott National Committee, which is comprised of the largest swath of civil society organizations, which has been something that actually counters an unaccountable leadership for years, is this swath of civil society organizations have asked for something very basic and very simple. And that is for those who care about Palestine and Palestinians and their self-determination, that they actually express that solidarity by demanding that 3 basic tenets of international law be adhered to, which is the end of the occupation, the right of return, and the end of structural discrimination against the Palestinians within the state. And based upon that, when this began, it began as a movement, as a call. It began on the margins. And we've seen that this movement that was dismissed as fringe, that was laughable because of its lack of political power and association with mainstream politics, was dismissed. And yet by 2009, the president of AIPAC, in his address to the AIPAC members and constituents, listed BDS as the second most looming threat to Israel after Iran's nuclear program. And so to say that BDS doesn't have some sort of tangible impact is a joke. It's a joke because we've seen that in the fact that it's become central to considerations has made itself extremely relevant. In terms of whether or not Palestinian leadership has adopted it, Palestinian leadership can't even fulfill their own promises to go to the ICC for war crimes committed in Gaza. They couldn't even pursue, they rescinded the Gaza report from the Human Rights Council as a result of American pressure. And as a result of Oslo, because of that American pressure, they certainly don't want to alienate their partner for peace by declaring a boycott against them, in part or in whole, even though some have said it in part or in whole, they don't want to, and they've made that clear that they can't, because Israel is a partner for peace under these auspices. I think that that's strategically short-sighted. I think that you can do both, and yet they fail to. And so I don't think that the lack of association with that leadership, which is dependent on its existence and its relevance on external funding, which opposes the boycott, is any indication of the boycott's viability. In terms of its movement, yes, obviously in Europe it's going to move a lot faster because the different domestic political considerations don't exist. And in the US, however, it's gaining incredible traction. And we can see that because of its adoption by the mainstream, churches, by figures like Roger Waters, Alice Walker, Angela Davis, and others who have taken a public stance on this issue. That we are seeing steady strides, much, much more significant strides than we even saw in the anti-apartheid movement against South Africa, where these same strides took more decades than just the one, not even the one, that this movement has been in existence. And so whether or not the mainstream idea is that it targets the occupation itself and not the entire idea, I think, yes, it's a consideration. But BDS doesn't propose to solve the conflict. BDS is a tactic, and its tactical goal is to apply pressure onto the state of Israel. And for that, it works incredibly well, and it's been working, and it will continue to serve that function.
I agree with that. I think it's the boycotts that I described, which are the ones that actually exist, and actually the EU settlement guidelines, occupation guidelines that the Israelis are so worked up about, are the best example, maybe right now, of that, or at least the most newsworthy example of it. The EU on its own has decided, to restrict any cooperation with certain limitations with the Israeli occupation. And that's an excellent thing. That's really a great thing. And I think that helps enormously. And I think that the more that can expand, the better. But I do think that Noura's point, which is absolutely accurate, that this is a tactic and it's not a solution-solving thing, and it needs to be coupled with a whole, some palette of other things,
as well as the diplomatic track,
all of that, everything,
the media track, a legal track,
nonviolent protests,
protests,
all of it,
none of which have been institutionalized, all of which are necessary and necessitate support, funding, and a leadership that can help usher this kind of approach.
I agree with that.
As you're answering, just make sure this is part of your closing remarks. So if there's anything you want to add, just throw it in.
I think that's right, and that means that one of the challenges is to have a consensus of a common goal, and that really needs to be a clear-cut objective. Otherwise, this is just going to founder, and I think that's true of the entire Palestinian movement, which is actually divided into three. The majority, at least, who live under occupation, who are still committed to a two-state solution, even though they're very skeptical about it, just like the Israeli majority. The followers of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who want some Islamic thing in Palestine, maybe with the Jews and Christians tolerated but disempowered, and this idea of a one-state solution that has most currency in universities in the West, among Palestinians, but hasn't been adopted by any major Palestinian political movement. That's something you said earlier, and you're right about that.
Right. But that's mentioned that it's only concentrated in the West.
Well, it mainly is, in my view. I mean, that's my opinion. I mean, I see organizations especially in British and American universities, pursuing this with great vigor, and I see elements of it reflected in PA policies under Prime Minister Fayyad, but not much. There's no major political faction among the Palestinians that has embraced a one-state idea and whatever. But there needs to be a consensus on the national goal. And there's a three-way split here between the two-state majority, the Islamic minority, and the even smaller one-state minority. And this, I think, truly is a conversation that would behoove Palestinians to have. The Israelis have the same problem, by the way. They have not got a consensus themselves, even within the government, about what they want and what they need. They fundamentally disagree. There's an annexationist minority that is pushing the agenda, and a sort of compromise oriented or inclined majority that is sitting back and letting them do it because they're too comfortable and they don't feel the pain and pressure. And that's the $64,000 question now facing this Palestinian national movement, is how to apply pressure on the ordinary Israelis to feel the pain of occupation so that it starts to move. And I don't think anyone can claim to have solved that question, frankly.
Well, I definitely think that one of the main things that needs to be done to challenge that Israeli population that's entrenched and doesn't want to move is to apply that pressure through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Sending the message that this type of structural difference in which you live in, where there is by law and policy and decree a privilege afforded to a Jewish population, Jewish nationals who are also citizens, that population, by virtue of their incontrovertible character, right? That this needs to be challenged. But instead of challenging that, we've accepted this as something that is an ipso facto reality, and now we have to work around that. And yet Palestinians who live within the state are also not just those under occupation, the 4.5 million. We cannot forget the 1.2 million who live within the state and are also subject to institutionalized discrimination as well as forced displacement from their homes. 70,000 Palestinians who are citizens of the state in the Negev, in the south of Israel, are now at risk of forced removal by the government in order to build a settlement within the state, a settlement for Jews only within the state, as well as a forest. And so, moving forward, we need to think fundamentally, how is it that we can challenge this basic premise of a settler colonial state that affords privilege to one set of people by law, policy, and decree? How does a stateless population do that? Negotiations are one piece of it only. Negotiations under the terms of Oslo are absolutely detrimental and not the path to pursue. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions is one tactic to apply the pressure that you explained was necessary. There's legal pressure that can be applied. There is media pressure that can be applied. There is literary pressure that can be applied. There is cultural pressure that can be applied, and yet none of it is being leveraged because of the terms that we are stuck with. And so yes, moving forward, the most fundamental piece that's necessary is an accountable leadership that can actually pursue these goals, and that leadership needs to be accountable also to do the most fundamental thing, which is to articulate a national liberation strategy and those goals for its population.